It's no secret Mass Effect Andromeda was an utter failure. While it greatly succeeded in its gameplay and visuals, its story and world left a lot to be desired. Which is a horrible thing to say regarding a Mass Effect property when its claim to fame is its story and world. A lot of Andromeda's failure can be chalked up to mismanagement from EA and BioWare with the forced engine change and the realization that they bit off way more than they can chew only 2 years before release. If you want a much more in-depth breakdown of the failure of Andromeda, go check out my prior video, because in today's video, I want to discuss one aspect of Andromeda's development specifically: procedural generation. The initial concept of Andromeda centered around procedurally generated planets, and that you, the Pathfinder, would be more concerned with exploration and discovery rather than combat and destruction. BioWare planned on using algorithms to procedurally generate each world in the game, allowing for near infinite possibilities in exploration. However, during development, they ran into hurdle after hurdle, and that concept was scrapped. The main reasons being it was just too hard to implement on the Frostbite engine, and how could they implement a sprawling BioWare-level story into a game that was procedurally generated? So what exactly is procedural generation? Procedural generation is a method of creating data algorithmically instead of manually. Artists will create a series of assets that are then randomized in a random seed generator for players to explore. This saves developers a ton of development time because this algorithm is used to randomize worlds instead of them actually laying it out by hand. Sometimes you can generate sprawling, beautiful worlds or cold, desolate wastelands. This has been a concept in gaming for some time now, only with a handful of games actually managing to pull it off. Just look at Minecraft, Dwarf Fortress, or Valheim. With an emphasis on exploration, BioWare wanted the core concept of Andromeda to be able to explore hundreds of procedurally generated planets. Mass Effect Andromeda was supposed to be a game about exploration and survival in an infinite procedurally generated galaxy. Whether a distant mountain or a planet hanging low on the horizon, you could go there. You can fly seamlessly from the surface of a planet to another, and every star in the sky is a sun that you can visit. Where you'll go and how fast you'll make your way through the universe is up to you. It's yours for the taking. If you think that concept sounds familiar, then you're right, because it's basically No Man's Sky. And yes, I did just copy word for word that last bit directly off of the About page on their website. No Man's Sky, while being incredibly rocky at launch, actually turned into a solid game. In preparation for this video, I tried playing it for the first time, and let me tell you, it's pretty great. The feeling of flying through the galaxy is fantastic. Landing and exploring felt fresh, and the resource management and building mechanics were pretty seamless. While I was playing, I can honestly say No Man's Sky scratched that Mass Effect itch. Briefly. If you've been on my channel for any amount of time, you know that I love story games. You can give me a mechanically shit game, but if the story sucked me in, you bet your sweet bippy I'm finishing that game. No Man's Sky held my attention for a good long while until I figured out its loop. There were brief moments where I picked up a distress signal or ran into a pirate or found weird interdimensional things. But at the end of the day, it just kept reverting back to go to this system, scan this thing, mine this thing, find this thing, return and claim your reward. Rinse and repeat over and over again. Now, it wasn't all tedious. Little bits and pieces really kept me invested, such as the language mechanic. You have to find broken pieces of alien language on multiple different planets in order to understand what they are saying to you, which is also a mechanic Andromeda tossed around before it was scrapped. There were also these robotic sentinels you could run into. They were either hyper-aggressive or would start to monitor you if you tore up the environment too much. They also reminded me of something else from the game. Oh, that's right. Yeah, they're basically the remnant from Andromeda. No Man's Sky has a lot of interesting things going for it, but the story is very light, with the gameplay mechanics and exploration taking center stage. While, yes, the story they seem to be telling in the background is actually really interesting, it's the frequency of that story and the means to progress it through repetitive actions that bothers me. And I sunk a good 22 hours into this game as well. This isn't to say No Man's Sky is bad. No, by all means, it's fantastic. I'd suggest not going in expecting much on the story side and really just immersing yourself in the worlds you discover. I can also imagine multiplayer is the superior way to play, so if you have the opportunity, get some buds and play the game. It's on Game Pass and it's absolutely redeemed itself. Expect a video on that subject at some point in the future. This is all a very long-winded way of saying No Man's Sky is like what Mass Effect Andromeda wanted to be. There are so many similarities to what Andromeda almost was to what No Man's Sky is. Yet my major gripe with No Man's Sky, that being the light story, is a major reason as to why Andromeda axed the procedural generated planets in the first place. What's crazy is that it took up to 2 years before release for them to realize that. That seems like a pretty glaring issue that they should have addressed in the beginning, right? But this is actually a really interesting question. Can a procedurally generated game even have a compelling story? A compelling BioWare level story? Well, speaking as someone who's never made a game in their life, I have an idea. The thing is, we can't have total procedural generation, not like No Man's Sky. As I said, that game is gameplay first, story second. So having a massively infinite explorable universe that is totally random isn't going to affect much story-wise because that's the point. You're supposed to be more interested in exploring rather than figuring out the complex emotions behind Polo's lifeless lizard eyes. You're just a cog in this giant wheel. Your character doesn't take center stage. You are simply part of this grand universe. That concept works beautifully for No Man's Sky. Mass Effect, on the other hand, it's not that simple. Unless Andromeda was going to be a one-and-done game, which it wasn't, you can't do that. Mass Effect is story first, gameplay second, and above all else, it's extremely character-driven. So having a Mass Effect game where the Pathfinder is just a cog in a giant wheel and your character doesn't take center stage, it's just not gonna work. And having a key gameplay loop be something similar to go to the system, scan this thing, mine this thing, find this thing, return and claim your reward, again, it's not gonna be Mass Effect. When you have a gameplay loop like that, it's basically impossible to have a gripping emotional story, especially when the game is expected to have sequels. If you want this grand scale space opera narrative, you can't have random planets that not everyone will find because that ruins the cohesiveness of the whole story and universe. So with that being said, is it even possible to make a truly procedurally generated Mass Effect and still maintain a story? Yes and no. It can work if it's procedurally generated in a different sense. So here's how it could work. If I go to this specific location on the map, I will find the desert planet LV-420. If you go to this specific location on the map, you will find the desert planet LV-420. If he goes there, if she goes there, we will all find the same desert planet LV-420. We will all see that it's arid with high amounts of radiation, high amounts of resources, low amounts of water, and low amounts of native non-intelligent highly aggressive species. That's all the same for everybody who plays the game. However, when we land, that's a different story. Instead of procedurally generated planets, we will have procedurally generated terrain. When the player lands on a planet, the world generates a 3,000 kilometer map, roughly the same size of the Volga from Metro Exodus. So if the player lands on LV-420, they will find randomly generated deserts with all manner of resources to collect, things to explore, and monsters to fight. When the player decides to leave, the map is lost, and will randomly generate a new map once they land on the planet again. But let's say the player really likes the map generated. Well, they can keep it by building a forward operating base, which will save the location and allow the player to start a colony. These FOBs can be upgraded into specific outposts: research, military, or commercial. Each one of these specific outposts will grant the player new/upgraded weapons, new/upgraded armor, bonus resources, etc. If the player leaves the outpost, they can procedurally generate other chunks from the planet and continue to explore to their heart's content, placing markers down, allowing the colonists to collect the resources from the area even after the player leaves and the chunk is despawned. If the procedural generation is done this way, if a sequel is ever created, those planets are still there and easily usable. They don't disappear or come out of nowhere for plot reasons because we all saw it and we all could visit it in the prior game. I think the key here is to not boast about thousands of explorable worlds, because if you have that many worlds, looking at you, Starfield, you obviously can't have thousands of interesting and unique things to do on each and every planet. If you have thousands of randomly generated planets, players will start to notice some constants with the procedural generation. So if we keep it to, say, 30 completely explorable planets with randomly generated terrain, it offers the developers the ability to create far more unique and interesting things on each planet that will keep the players exploring each and every planet. But also, keeping it to 30 planets allows a writer to really add interesting backstories to said planet that they wouldn't be able to do if the planet itself was random. So let's say LV-420 once had a civilization that wiped itself out through nuclear war. Only on that planet will we be able to randomly generate bombed out cities, nuclear wastelands, or other secrets that may hide. There's a story to find here. How we do it is completely random, but it's the same story for everyone who plays it. Now let's go to LV-69. It's a jungle planet with extremely aggressive creatures and very primitive life. We obviously won't find any destroyed cities or lost technology. but we could find extremely rare and valuable plants that could aid the initiative in some way. This is a game about exploration, so let's give the players interesting things to explore. Let's give them an incentive. You can't have extremely interesting and complex stories when everything is random. You can, if it's a mixture of both. As I said, that's my biggest gripe with No Man's Sky. After a while, everything is kind of the same. Yeah, it's all randomly generated and looks different, but after a while the player realizes, oh, there's going to be a space station in this system. There will be a planet with the same collectibles on every other planet, and these creatures look different enough from the last planet, but I could still recognize some features. However, if we have a limited number of planets with pre-written backstory with randomly generated terrain, it allows each and every player to have a unique experience on every single planet, every time they play. It really all comes down to just because you can doesn't mean you should. It doesn't have to be massive and ever sprawling. It could be simple. What's crazy is this idea was tossed around but ultimately scrapped in favor of hand-built planets. Now obviously I'm not a game dev and I know making a game is far harder than bullshitting on YouTube videos, but I'm really curious as to know why they scrapped it. Because if you ask me, that concept sounds fantastic. But speaking of just because you can doesn't mean you should, let's talk about gameplay. Mass Effect Andromeda also absolutely nailed the combat system with their implementation of a fluid class system. No longer were players constrained to solely playing as one class. Now they can change it on the fly, while also allowing for more freedom in player movement, letting players dash side to side, leap into the air, and use a jetpack. Mass Effect has always had rather stiff combat mechanics, and Andromeda faithfully updated the mechanics to be one of the best playing Mass Effect games in the series. However, therein lies the issue. They developed this extremely solid gameplay mechanic that gives the player amazing combat prowess. Yet that's the problem. The main concept of the game is that you are a pathfinder, flying around Andromeda discovering new and interesting worlds to settle. The pathfinder isn't supposed to be a space marine. This fluid class system makes me not only feel like a space marine, but like the Doom Marine. We are supposed to be explorers. And if we keep the concept that Alec passed the title of Pathfinder to his child who hasn't really seen any combat yet, then they shouldn't be this elite. Instead of an outright fluid class system, I feel like the better, more lore-friendly option is allowing the players to swap between their teammates, like in Dragon Age Inquisition. This way, it never locks you into a particular playstyle, yet remains reasonable and doesn't feel too OP. Say your Rider is an infiltrator, but you want to try out a biotic. Swap to Cora, and boom, now you can. Again, I love the fluid class system, it just doesn't work story-wise. We are not trying to make a story about a space marine. We are making a story about an explorer. We don't want to be Shepard 2.0, we want to be Ryder. Our story is about exploration, not decimation. And speaking of story, let's get into that. So with all this gameplay to emphasize exploration, how do we get a Mass Effect level story out of it? Well, let's lay down some ground rules. 1. The story must maintain an explorer first, soldier second mentality. Ryder has had training but hasn't seen any real action yet. 2. This is a fish out of water / hero's journey type story. And 3. We need to drop the grand-scale space adventure Mass Effect fans loved about the original trilogy because we need to innovate, not replicate. These are the tenets that these writers claim to be following while working on Andromeda. But, well, we kinda know how that turned out. What I find so funny is the fact that the writers wrote a, oh no, evil aliens are trying to take over the galaxy and we must stop them type of story, when that's exactly what we are doing. We are the aliens trying to take over the galaxy. We do not belong in Andromeda, yet we are colonizing planets that don't belong to us. There's so much we can do with this concept too. And yes, I know it may seem like a very alien concept for humans to understand. You know, that being a story about people coming into a place they don't belong and claiming it's theirs. I know it's a very foreign concept. I know there are probably not many stories of struggles and drama you could write about the dangers of colonization. That was sarcasm for all you special people out there. The story basically writes itself at this point, but let's get into some specifics. While most planetary terrain in the Helios cluster is randomly generated, there will be an additional 10 planets that I'll call story planets. These story planets are completely locked and not procedurally generated at all. You can only land in one specific spot, and they are basically equivalent to the worlds seen in the original trilogy. Of the 10, 7 are home to intelligent Andromeda species such as the Angara, Jardan, Ket, and many more. Now, there are 3 main differences here not seen in the game. The Ket are a species native to Andromeda that don't reproduce through exaltation because that's stupid. The Jardan are still present and never created the remnant or left behind any vaults because that's just a rehash. And most of the Andromeda species aren't all necessarily spacefaring. I'd equate most of them to that of 21st or 22nd century Earth, meaning they are just barely beginning to stretch their wings into spaceflight. The only spacefaring species are the Kets, Angara, and Jardan, but they're only limited to space travel within their own systems. This is where the main drama of the story arises from. As Milky Way species arrive, we realize we are far more advanced compared to any of these species, so the initiative is left with a choice. Do we, or do we not, uplift these species? Like the Solarian did with the Krogan and just began to do with the Yogg, this debate will echo throughout the initiative. Do we, the aliens, disrupt the natural order of things and give them advanced technology and help them progress? This will be the story slowly building in the background as we explore and create more colonies across the cluster. Eventually, this debate will basically divide the initiative into two factions, uplift or distance. There can be an argument made for both sides of this disagreement with positives and negatives for each. We let them evolve at their own rate, not to disturb the natural order of things whilst also allowing us to monitor them and always maintain technological superiority. Or do we uplift them, saving them from the potential decades of death and destruction whilst also greatly influencing them to be far more beneficial to us in the long run? Monitor or manipulate? The main conflict will be around the civil war that would inevitably break out within the initiative due to these conflicting moral standings. And this is also where the first massive choice would lie. Which side do you choose? When you have a story about exploration, with the main driving force being a stranger in a strange land, you can't tell a space marine story, and you most definitely can't tell a fate of the universe rests in your shoulders type of story. It has to be more interpersonal. It has to be grounded. It can't be grandiose because the big grandiose things are what you discover on your adventures. That's the main drive of the game. You'll have 40 worlds to explore, each with their own history and unique environments. 30 of those worlds will be totally random each time you play. Yeah, the story may be the same on LV-420 each time you play, but maybe on your first playthrough you never discover why there actually was a nuclear war, or maybe you never find the hidden vault with experimental technology. That's the gameplay loop. Complex hidden stories attached to 30 worlds that can only be discovered through exploration. This presents an incentive to explore. And while the player is exploring, there will be a slow burn political story brewing in the background that will force the Pathfinder to either unite or divide the initiative. This isn't a rehash. There aren't any evil aliens taking over the galaxy. There isn't lost advanced alien technology, and the fate of the galaxy is not in the hands of one human. If anything, it's the fate of the initiative in the hands of one human. All the drama will come from the Milky Way species airing their same dirty laundry they never fixed in their home galaxy. Same shit, different galaxy. Again, there's no need to visit ancient aliens with wondrous technology because that's us. We're the ancient aliens with wondrous technology. There's no need for invaders taking in corrupting Andromeda species because that's us. We're the invaders forcing Andromeda species to bend to our will. There's an amazingly beautiful story right there and it was just wasted. Now, I'm not gonna go super in depth into the story because we'd be here for hours, but you can get the gist of what I'm saying. We've already had the big scale space opera universe-ending threat in the Reapers. We don't need that story again in something lesser because this universe already perfected that story. I mean, imagine how stupid it would be if Star Wars tried to do the Death Star twice or the Rebellion versus the Empire again. Oh, wait. As the creative director of Andromeda said, what we need is a story about a hero who then becomes a legend. Not all heroes slay eldritch monsters. The hero doesn't have to literally save the universe. They just have to save their own universe, meaning their people, their tribe, and their world. That's how you tell an impactful story about exploration. The drama doesn't come from massive threats, it comes from the people. So while Ryder is exploring and charting new worlds, establishing colonies, this division will ultimately split the initiative. Now you have this character, whose father everyone looked up to for leadership, suddenly thrust into their father's position after his untimely demise. You have this greenhorn, who's never seen any live combat leading humanity's exploration effort. This quote-unquote hero just wants to explore and help their species flourish, yet they're suddenly caught in the middle of this civil war. How can one person unify their people? Well, in order to do that, it'll take a legend. So I guess this brings us back to the initial question. Can you make a procedurally generated Mass Effect? If you ask me, the answer is yes.